Well, welcome everyone to the Quest webinar on spring birding and the third Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas. We're excited to have you joining us this afternoon. And my name is Emma Horrigan, and I'm here today with our guest speaker, Mike Cadman, and as well as Justin Peter from Quest, who you don't see right now, but will be joining at the end of the webinar to host the Q&A session. And so as I said, my name is Emma Horrigan. I'm the Conservation Projects and Education Manager at Ontario Nature. And Ontario Nature is one of 5 main partners involved in Atlas 3. And we are thrilled to be supporting this important community science initiative, which is instrumental in supporting bird conservation efforts across the province. And volunteers play a very central role to this Atlas project, as well as past Atlases. And Ontario Nature's Nature Network members have really been instrumental in their involvement in these projects, as well as engaging their local birding communities in these efforts. And this webinar today is part of a series being run in collaboration between Quest and Ontario Nature. And I hope after today's session that you'll be inspired to learn more about birds and participate in this important project. And with that, I am very pleased to introduce you to our speaker today, Mike Cadman, who is the coordinator for Atlas 3. Mike is a songbird biologist for Canadian Wildlife Service, Ontario region, and he's been in that role since 1992. Much of his professional life has been devoted to breeding bird atlases, and he coordinated Ontario's first 2 atlas projects, so the one between 1981 and 1985, and the second atlas from 2001 to 2005, and was involved in co-editing the books that resulted from those efforts. And we were lucky enough to have him here again, coordinating the 3rd Atlas for Ontario. In his role at CWS, he has been involved in the Ontario Forest Bird Monitoring Program. He's also involved in the development of the Marsh Monitoring Program and has worked extensively on aerial insectivores. He's co-authored status reports for 5 species at risk and is a member of the recovery teams for 4 species at risk. Mike resides in Wellington County, which is where he does most of his birding, but of course he's traveled widely in pursuit of birds, and his favorite trip was a Quest tour of Tanzania, where he says the mammals were just as great as the birds. So we're really excited to have Mike here this afternoon to talk to us more about the 3rd Breeding Bird Atlas, and I'll just hand it over to Mike. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Emma, and thanks to everyone else for sitting in today. It's kind of odd giving these presentations where I can't see you folks at all. Disconcerting, and I know there's lots of old friends in the audience who participated in previous atlases, and it'd be great to be able to see you. But anyway, it's great to be here today, and I'm looking forward to telling you more about the Atlas project. Just quickly mention our website. If you haven't gone and looked, it's underlined here on this page, and justbirdsontario.org will get you to a vast amount of information about the project. So I encourage you to go and look at that. And I'll put that up again at the end. So as Emma mentioned, Ontario Nature is one of the 5 sponsoring organizations for the Atlas. The rest of them are listed here: OFO, Birds Canada, Ministry of Natural Resources, and the organization I work for, Climate Change Canada. As was previously mentioned, we have done 2 previous atlases in Ontario. The early 80s and the early 2000s were on a 20-year cycle, which is the way it's done right around the world. And of course, it's exciting to be getting on to Atlas number 3. I promise this is the last one that I'll be involved in coordinating. The Atlas structure is complicated. We have lots of committees that even the Ravens are getting together to chat about the Atlas project. But The management committee that oversees things with representatives from those 5 sponsoring organizations, and then we have this whole array of committees looking at every aspect of the project. And we have numerous working groups that come and go, looking at different things as the project develops. I show a couple here. We have a parks working group and an ARU working group, and I'll come back a little bit later to tell you a bit more what that's all about. But just a lot of very capable people involved in all of these committees behind the scenes, designing things and getting the project up and running. We have a small staff of myself and Kaylin Bumelis is the assistant coordinator at Birds Canada. And Birds Canada also provides database management, GIS work, and we'll be hiring technicians over the coming summers to help us in lots of different ways, filling in gaps that the volunteers can't cover. And we have 47 regional coordinators, and I'll talk a bit more about those. And as of a week or so ago, we had about 1,500 volunteers signed up for the project, which is a great start. I'm sure that will continue to build as the project develops. So really, the atlas is all about it's an atlas, so of course it's about mapping, but we want to map the distribution and abundance of the province's birds, and we want to compare that to the previous 2 atlases. We've got a great solid base of information there that we can compare to. We want to look at population sizes and how that's changed over time with those in comparison to those other atlases. We want to, while we've got all these people in the field counting birds, we get them to collect information on locations that significant species are found, and that's a gold mine of information for species at risk conservation. We want to, as ever, expand our coverage of the north, and we're ramping that up considerably in Atlas 3. And of course, the goal here is we're taking stock and we're getting this data out into a form where it can be used for all the different purposes that Atlas data is used for research and conservation projects, lots of different things that the data gets used for. So in a nutshell, we're taking stock, but really the atlas is, and I'll run through this, it's an all hands on deck, no holds barred, pull out all the stops, science-based inventory of the birds of the province. And basically we want to leave no stone unturned to get as thorough an assessment as we can of the birds of the province, where they are, how many of them there are, and how they've changed over time. We're powered by the birding community, folks like yourselves right across the province are going to provide the bulk of the data for the project. And one of the reasons that the project's very popular is that it's actually a very enjoyable thing to do. So encourage people who are interested in birds to join us, get involved in the project, and collect data. And the data has so many applications that it's really an extremely useful way to spend your time as a birder, as well as being quite enjoyable. I'll try and get, I hope, some of the fun of this. It's all about numbers and maps and things, but really behind the scenes are people out in the field doing the things they love to do, collecting information and providing it to us for applications in all these different ways. So to run the project, we divide the province up into regions. We've got 47 of these, and this is the Peterborough region, number 16 here. And as you can see, it's made up of 10 by 10 kilometer squares. The whole basis of the project is collecting data by 10 by 10 kilometer squares. But each of these regions has a regional coordinator or a team of coordinator. As I said, 47 regions. I think about 70 people are involved as regional coordinators, and these folks are really the backbone of the project. They're going to be screening all the data locally. They're working with local volunteers to ensure that all the squares get filled, and that the data is up to snuff. So if you're interested in the project, you go on the website, you can find your regional coordinator, and please contact them and make arrangements to participate. So new maps we've just produced for this new atlas. You can see the 10 by 10 kilometer square here. We've broken down the square to show the major habitat types in it, because this is the atlas square map there is the sort of main tool that the volunteer has to figure out where they're going to go, because their goal is to find all the species that are nesting in that square. So they need to know where all the habitats are and how to get at them and which ones are accessible and which ones aren't, and actually get out into the field then during the breeding season, which is any time really from January through August, September. But for the bulk of the work, it's really May, June, July is when the great majority of the birds are nesting and when the great majority of the data gets collected. The numbered points on here are point counts, and I will talk more about that a little bit later. Okay, so the data is collected this time. In the past atlases, people would report which birds they saw in which 10 by 10 kilometer square. This time around, much more precise ability to tell us where you're birding and what birds you're seeing. So on this graphic, you can see up at the top right, there's a track along a road. So this the birder went along the road, and they will put together a checklist of the birds that they saw on that particular track, and how many of them there were, and what breeding evidence they found. And I'll talk more about that. But you can also do a precise point, go to one location, sit there for a few minutes, and record all the birds that you see at one location. Or you can do a track like down at the bottom left, a particular track through, in this case, a protected area. This is a conservation area. And this is a new feature of this atlas that we think will be particularly useful, that people can tell us which checklists are inside and outside of these protected areas. And that's going to allow us, as part of the overall atlas project, to assess the value of these protected areas in conserving the birds of the province. And I should say at the same time, we're working with the ministry, Ontario Parks and the national parks. They are allowing atlasers into the parks to collect data for free, but we have to make special arrangements for that through regional coordinators. But the parks folks are very much on side with getting us out into the field and collecting data inside the parks. A new feature for this atlas is that if you see on the graphic there, you can see your track. So you can, we have an app that will plot your track as you're going along, collecting that information for you, or you can enter that track later yourself on the website. But you can also put information on precise locations of particular birds. So in this case, you're walking along that track, you look out across the field, and there's a snipe, which is an unusual bird in the Guelph area in the breeding season. So you can record, put a dot precisely on the map where you saw it, and provide some information on that, and that goes into the database, and that has all kinds of different applications down the road, as you might imagine. So when I said collect information on breeding evidence of the birds, we have a sort of internationally approved set of breeding evidence categories and codes that are used for this purpose. Everything from, up at the top left, a bird like a common yellowthroat sitting there in a wetland in its breeding season, that bird would be considered a possible breeder. Up the top right, the wood ducks, a pair of those birds in the breeding season in their suitable habitat, those birds will be considered probable breeders. And then at the bottom are different ways of, some of the different ways of confirming breeding. It can be obvious things like this, where you find a nest with young, or you have newly fledged young, like we have with the sandhill crane or with the pied-billed grebe. It can also be things like distraction displays from killdeer, or it could be birds carrying food to feed their young. So you can confirm breeding in a number of ways, and the goal for the atlasers in each square is to find all the species that are nesting there and try and confirm breeding for as many as possible of them. And I mentioned the app. So the app's still in development. It's out being tested by a lot of people at the moment. But basically it works very simply. You just report how many of each birds you see on each of your particular track or your checklist, and the highest breeding evidence that you have for each of those species. So just highlighted the screech owl here, sitting here in his hole. It's still snowy, but screech owls will commence nesting while there's snow around, and so it's quite legitimate for the screech owl to be reporting breeding evidence in the in the early spring. So I mentioned point counts a couple of times, just wanted to come back to those. So these numbered points on the map here, this is how we're going to assess relative abundance of the species right across the province. So within each of these squares, we've randomly located 40 points on roadsides. And the atlaser, now only atlasers who can identify birds well by song can do the full scale point counts. And that involves then going to each of these points, or choosing actually 20 of those 40 that are readily accessible to the and they're not on busy roads and that kind of thing, places that are nice and quiet where you can do a point count, and count up all the birds that you see during a 5-minute period. And then that information goes into your app or you input into the website, and that information gets used to allow us to plot some distributions across the province of these birds. And I'll show you some maps later. In addition to these roadside points, though, you can see the roads don't always necessarily well represent all of the habitats. There's a lot of the forest areas there aren't well represented on roads. And so each square, we've assessed how well the road layer represents the overall habitats in the square. And then each square has a sort of a customized list of off-road points that need to get done to sort of flesh out the full complement of point counts for that square. So in this case, I've circled it in the middle there where you need to put 4 point counts into broadleaf forest and 1 into a mixed forest in that square to sort of round things out. And again, we have an app for this, but you can also, I suspect, not everyone likes looking at the phone doing this kind of thing because it's quite intense for a 5-minute period. You can report that on a notebook, on a data form, and then submit the data later to the computer. I will mention that we're introducing something new this time where we've provided regional coordinators with a couple of these little handheld recording devices. And if you don't know your birds well by song, you can still do a point count by visiting those spots and recording for 5 minutes the birds that are around you. And then that information gets downloaded at the end of your visit, and experts will be interpreting that information, pulling off the data over the course of the winter. So there's a role there for people collecting that information who aren't necessarily skilled enough to count all the birds themselves by ear. Okay, so our overall coverage goals for the project are sort of outlined here. The dark green area in the south, we're aiming to get complete coverage. Basically, we want every square there to get a minimum of 20 hours of coverage in the peak of the breeding season in June and July. And we want to get the 25 point counts in each one of those squares, either recorded point counts or in-person point counts. And then in the central area, the sort of southern part of the boreal layer, we're aiming for about 5% of the squares. And in the far north, we're aiming for about 2% of the squares. But I'll talk a little bit more about that one as we go along. And so if you haven't seen the Atlas book, it is still on sale. You can get at it from the Ontario Nature website or through the Atlas website. And this is what it looks like inside, and it is a really valuable resource for people who are going to be out collecting information for the project. So as you can see, it's mostly about maps and explaining the maps, but the map at the bottom left here is the breeding evidence map where we plot the darker the dot here is the stronger the evidence of breeding. And the black dots actually show squares where the species was reported in Atlas 1, but not in Atlas 2. And so you can see the pattern of change over time. The map at the top right is the plots from the point count data. And in Atlas 2, we got 68,000 point counts done, which we were kind of blown away by. A wonderful response from the birding community on that. And we're hoping we can do as well this time. We were the first in North America to devise this method of counting birds for Atlas projects. And we're going to be the first, certainly in Canada. Some of the Americans have zipped ahead of us on doing their atlases on less than a 20-year basis, and they may have their second atlas with point counts done before ours, but I guess we'll see. but these are going to allow us to compare back to 2001 in great detail. And we're going to be able to look at the pattern, the current pattern of occurrence of the birds across the province, but then how that's changed over the 20 years. And to me, this is going to be one of the strongest features of the atlas, a real gold mine of information that'll help greatly in determining level of threats, and also the patterns of change, I think, will be very useful in helping to understand the causes of the changes. In the middle of Atlas 2, the histogram there is a summary of how the birds changed over time, the sort of proportion of squares that the birds were in. In Atlas 3, we're going to be able to provide that as well, but we're going to be also be able to map these changes, not only in point counts, but using data from the breeding evidence map as well, to incorporate that so we get a more complete picture for some of the species that aren't necessarily well covered by point counts. And yeah. And then the rest of the page is really just about interpreting the various maps that you see, explaining this information to people, and you know, anything we can say at that point about why the changes that we're seeing are actually occurring. Okay, so I mentioned collecting information on rare species. We did have more than 10,000 sites of rare species reported in Atlas 2, and we're hoping we can do at least that well this time. I think given some of those new innovations I mentioned earlier, we should be able to exceed that this time, and that's a really valuable data set. So just in way of summary of some information from comparing the first two atlases and thinking a little bit about what we might expect to see in Atlas 3. So these are the list of species here that increased the most between the two atlas projects. No big surprise, I guess, that Canada goose came out on top, but other birds on there. You can see the house finch, which was sort of accidentally introduced into eastern North America in the 70s, expanded up into Ontario in the 80s, and increased greatly. Birds like blue-headed vireo nesting in mature coniferous forest areas, those have really expanded. A lot of those areas have increased in southern Ontario and expanded over time, and that population seems to be lifting as a result. Turkey vultures, as you know, more and more of those being seen all the time, large expansion. But we did see generally, though, a lot of large birds, like you notice here, Canada goose, turkey vulture, turkey, bald eagle, sandhill crane. These are some of the biggest birds in the province, and they're making the biggest increases. So a nice pattern there that a lot of these birds a lot of them are actually rebounding from former declines. So just to show you what this looks like on the maps, at least for some of the sort of more detailed maps of southern Ontario, the yellow dots on these squares indicate that the bird was reported in Atlas 2, but not Atlas 1. So you can see how the turkey expanded from a few squares. There's very few squares in there that don't have yellow dots, and that's where the reintroduction programs were starting back in the late 70s and early 80s. And then by 2000, the turkeys had expanded this far, and I guess the question is, how much further will they have expanded in Atlas 3? It's going to be exciting to see. Sandhill crane, another one. Now this bird wasn't being reintroduced, but it was expanding itself from its more northerly breeding areas up in the boreal forest. Again, you can see the yellow dots indicate new squares for Atlas 2. So you can see there were some birds previously nesting in Atlas 1 up around the Sault Ste. Marie area, north of the North Channel, on Manitoulin Island, and even a couple had moved onto the Bruce at that point. But then in Atlas 2, as you can see, just a huge expansion into the major wetlands right down in the southern part of the province. But as far as we can tell, this expansion has continued. So it's going to be really interesting to see how far the birds have gone, how many of those squares are actually filled in now. And luckily, you know, they're nice, big, conspicuous, loud birds, and I think we should be able to get a really good picture of their changes. Another one here, the bald eagle, greatly expanded between the two Atlas projects. Again, we've got a new nest at Guelph Lake, and most of the local reservoirs now have bald eagles nesting them in my area around Guelph. I'm sure the same kind of thing is happening right across southern Ontario. So it's going to be really interesting to see just the extent of that, the current status of the bird. The merlin, small raptor, small falcon, that again was very restricted in Atlas 1, but just exploded between atlases. And the numbers have continued to expand, so I think it's quite likely we'll fill in a lot more squares in southern Ontario in Atlas 3. But we need to get all the birders out there in the field to actually make that happen. One of the other groups of birds that's interesting to look at is birds that are sort of on the southern or on the just creeping into the southern part of the province. So birds like the Carolina wren, and there's lots of others, blue-gray gnatcatcher, red-bellied woodpecker, lots of others that are expanding. A lot of them are expanding over time, and it's going to be, again, really interesting to see how much expansion there is at this point for a lot of these species. Okay, now on the flip side, this is the list of species that declined the most between the projects and shows the number of squares that they dropped out of. And the atlas was really the first place in Canada to find this huge decline in the aerial insectivores. So birds like the nighthawk and the whippoorwill and the chimney swift and all of the swallows, the bank swallow there, the barn swallow, the cliff swallow. These are the birds showing the largest decline between the two atlas projects. And that has prompted an enormous amount of effort trying to, well, A, protect these species. So most of those birds are now on the protected lists, but there are also a lot of research going on to try and work out what is happening, what's causing those declines. Other things, though, grassland birds in particular show up here, and some of the shorebirds. The shorebirds are doing quite poorly right across the board, and spotted sandpiper and killdeer showed up as big declines. And again, we're hoping that those kind of things will slow down by the time we get data for Atlas 3, but we'll soon find out. So some of the declines then, the grassland birds, again, these black dots are squares that the birds were in Atlas 1, but not Atlas 2. So you can see quite a decline here for the upland sandpiper. And that the same kind of pattern seems to have happened for a lot of the grassland birds. Aerial insectivores like the purple martin, again, not many yellow dots on there, but lots of black dots. And the pattern for a lot of them seemed to be that the more northerly areas showed the more marked declines here. You can even see this pattern on the map. And in the case of the aerial insectivores, often it was inland areas away from the Great Lakes where the declines were most evident. They seem to be holding on around the edges of the Great Lakes quite well, and that may be something to do with milder temperatures and more stable insect populations. But again, we'll find out in Atlas 3 how true that pattern continues. Loggerhead shrike, another bird that's dependent on grassland, was always an uncommon bird, at least in the last century, but really declined down to just a few small areas left by Atlas 2, and the numbers have continued to dwindle, so we should be down to very few squares with these birds in Atlas 3, despite a large effort to reintroduce the species. And of course, not forgetting, I've been showing you maps and details of the south because it's easier to pick out the patterns, but of course, we're collecting the data right across the north, and it's going to be a big focus this time of data collection for the atlas, much as it was in Atlas 2, but I'll mention a couple of things we're doing that are new this time. So we talk about taking stock. So I know some of you will have seen this before, but I love talking about it. Just showing the list of the most abundant birds. So we took those 68,000 point counts, and they allowed us to tally up which species are most abundant and how abundant they are in the province. So think about it for a second, and I'll just run through the top, I think it's 10 or 15 species. Okay, off we go. So common grackle comes in at about 3 million, and no big surprise to those of us in Southern Ontario, I suppose. European starling, just slightly more. Red-winged blackbirds, numbers building up here for these very familiar birds, but then suddenly, oh, swinks and thrush. Now we're talking some of the boreal birds, birds that are in that vast northern Ontario that makes up 80% of the province that we don't see much of in southern Ontario, other than perhaps as migrants. Red-eyed vireo does occur right throughout the south, but it occurs right throughout the much of the boreal anyway. American robin, a very, very widespread species and obviously familiar to everybody. Now we start getting though into some of the more the boreal birds. White-throated sparrow certainly here and there in southern Ontario, but mostly in the north. Yellow-rumped warbler, same thing. I'm doing well in the pine plantations and such in southern Ontario, but mostly a boreal bird. Same with magnolia, warbler, chipping sparrow again, likes urban neighborhoods as well as boreal forest. Dark-eyed junco, again down around in the winter, but not much in the more developed areas in the breeding season. Golden crown kinglet right up there. And then finally, here we go, the commonest bird in the province in Atlas 2, and it's going to be interesting to see if that's still true in Atlas 3, is the Nashville warbler. And I showed you that map earlier of their distribution, very much concentrated in the boreal forest, particularly the northwestern part of the province, where really not many birders go outside of Atlas periods. So when it comes to data collection for the project, the bulk of the work is going to get done by birders, mostly amateur folks, and a few professionals built in, working hard, collecting data where they can. In Atlas 3, I mentioned those handheld devices. There's another device similar called an autonomous recording unit that's going to be very important in collecting data throughout the north. And we've got quite an extensive effort this time to increase coverage using these devices. And they're wonderful things. You can put one out in January. You can go out there on the snowmobile, strap one of these to a tree and program it to wake up in spring. And you can program when it listens. And so most of these, we have a set pattern of when they listen. You program them for a few minutes at intervals in the morning, and then usually something in the evening, and then something at night, because of course we want to pick up on the owls and the other birds that are active at night. And we can go back out there the following winter, pick these up, get all of that information, download it to a big database system, and then have experts do these interpretation on these. You can identify some of the birds on these automatically if it's a very simple song, and the abilities to actually identify more birds is coming over time, but very slowly. So a lot of this is going to be people listening to them. In fact, we're going to be asking birders to listen to these recordings over the winter and identify birds on them for us. So I mentioned the north, and this is the sort of far north part of the province, and these are the squares that were mostly done by volunteers in Atlas 3. And you can see lots of rows of dots, and a lot of these, if you start at the bottom right there, you've got the Moose River, and then I think it's the Albany, then the Attawapiskat, and you can see where how we got into much of the north. We're going to be covering a lot of these squares again. We've actually targeted repeating that work in Atlas 3. So we're going to be looking for people who want to, who have the right skill sets, who can get out into these remote areas and collect data for us. The people who like canoe trips and know their birds well and have good survival skills. But in addition to this volunteer work, we are working, the Wildlife Service is working to figure out if we're going to put these ARU units across Northern Ontario, where do we most strategically put them to get a better understanding of the occurrence and abundance of the birds across those areas? So I'm looking at this pattern, which is these are the main ecoregions across the far north part of the province, and there is actually a whole amount of work that's gone into determining where these points are and which one should be a priority to fill in the gaps between the work that the volunteers are providing. And we are, I should say that at the same time that we're doing this for the Atlas, there is a whole nationwide boreal bird monitoring program that's developing that we're tying into, that's going to provide that this information will fit into both of those at the same time. So we're really benefiting from that, some of that boreal work. Okay, so we've collected all this data. There's loads and loads of applications. I've listed a few things here. These are mostly things that the Wildlife Service has used the data for, but there are just lots and lots of applications and over and above these. But in terms of the species at risk, very helpful for determining the status, that COSEWIC determines the status of all the birds. And then we have to develop recovery strategies. So it's great to know where they are on the ground so that we can figure out what they need and how to go about conserving them. And then the critical habitat, which sites are particularly important for these, what are the characteristics of those sites, and that kind of thing has been a main focus of Atlas work. And I won't go through everything here, but up at the top right, lots of different research applications looking at how forestry affects the birds, how climate change is affecting the birds, land use change, other major things that are affecting the environment. And how that's those kind of changes are affecting the birds. Okay, so it's all about you folks, about birders getting out into the field, canoeing the north. I personally love atlasing on my bike, getting onto this quiet side roads and covering areas that way. It's about getting folks out into the field, enjoying themselves collecting data, and hope you'll consider joining us in the project. Our email contact info is all here. The email for the project, the website. We do have Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram accounts that you can look for. Just to summarize then, we have done this twice already, and we want to do it the third time and make this atlas the best one yet. This is Glen Cody. Many of you will know Glen, fording a stream up on the Hudson Bay lowlands in June when the snow's still on the ground and the creeks are just starting to melt, collecting data for the atlas. And really, I think, really showing the spirit of the birding community and helping get out there and collect this data. So I think now I'm gonna hand things back to Justin and Emma and Samantha, and see if we can deal with any questions you might have. So thanks very much for listening.
Hi everyone, I'm Justin Peter, and well, thank you very much, Mike, for that very informative presentation, and thank you all to all of you who are participating in this. And there are a number of pertinent questions here, a number of specific questions here. I was going to field them one by one, and if you have any questions, and if you haven't found the question tab, and you're a participant on this, you might find that the question tab tucked away in your little console at the right side of your screen. And so if you have any questions, feel free to ask, but there have been a few here. Rhonda is asking for owl surveying, how do you know which points to use?
Okay, so I didn't go into any detail on it, but we have, the Atlas has devised special surveys for owls, and the surveys are based on those point counts, the 40 point counts that you use. And so each of there's several different protocols, and each protocol for a species or a group of species that use similar habitats. And so there's a manual that describes for each species what the specific protocol is, and that protocol basically involves visiting those point count locations that have suitable habitat for that species. So I recently did the screech owl survey down in my area, and the way it works is I find the first 10 of those numbered point counts that have suitable habitat for screech owl. In that case, it's basically patches of forest or treed areas that have large mature trees in them that are adjacent to those point count locations. So I hope that answers that question.
I think it may have. That's great. Thank you very much. Nancy's asking a very interesting question. Sounds a little bit like an invitation. That Nancy's saying that she owns 300 acres near Minden, Ontario. And how are you planning to cover vast areas of private property?
Well, we really leave this to the local birders. And so each square is assigned a principal atlaser, but that's not meant to restrict things. Anybody can collect data in any square, but we have one person per square who's responsible for ensuring that the data, that the square is adequately covered. And so on our, what we provide to our volunteers is a letter that identifies them as an atlaser and explains what they want to do. And if they see a property that they're interested in visiting, they can put that letter in the mailbox with their contact info on it, and basically leave it to the private landowner. If they're interested, they can get back and contact the atlaser and make arrangements for them to go in and collect the data. That's about as far as we've got so far. We are working with Ontario Nature, who's given us information on where all their sites are. Nature Conservancy's done the same thing, and a number of other organizations are starting to do the same thing. We haven't yet talked to the land trusts, but I think that's another possibility, that people who whose properties have been set aside for by land trusts might well be a good source for collecting information on private land like that.
Great. And I suppose if Nancy herself wants to survey her property, she can also do that. No.
Yeah. And the other possibility, of course, would be to contact the regional coordinator for the area. If she goes on the website, she can quickly figure out which region she's in and which the regional coordinator is. Let them know. You'll be able to determine which square you're actually in. Or if you can tell the regional coordinator where you are, they'll be able to pass information and perhaps put you in touch with the atlaser for that square. And they could perhaps come out and help you cover the area if that's of interest to you.
That's great. Thank you. I have another question from Andy. It's a question I think you've sort of answered in part, just towards the end of your presentation. It has to do with the audio devices, and he was asking, can you please provide more information on the recording devices being made available for point counts? So you talked about them and how they work, and that you mentioned that birders will also listen to the recordings afterwards, but how do you get one?
You go to your regional coordinator. They're called Zoom H2N units. I actually have one. I won't wander off and get it, but I've been looking at them recently. They're new to me, so I'm just going through the manual myself, figuring out how to use it. But yeah, we provided each regional coordinator with 2 of these, only 2. Quite possibly we'll find some more funds and be able to get more out in future years. But our hope is really most of the areas south of the Shield, we're thinking we probably won't need to do much of the handheld recording, that there's lots of birders in most areas until you get into the more remote parts of Southern Ontario who can do the auditory sort of personal point counts. Certainly when you start getting on the Shield and further north, the number of birders thins out, and we might need to rely more and more on this approach. But certainly all of the regional coordinators do have those Zoom H2N units available for loan, and they're going to be sort of scheduling that out. The hope is, of course, you can do a lot of these points in a morning, and the people will just need the device for a few days, and they can pass it on to somebody else who can do more points in different squares. We're also thinking, I should say, I expect there may be people who really get into this and will want to do it in a whole bunch of squares, and we would certainly encourage people who are interested in that.
Okay, so I guess the lesson, I think the answer to many questions may be speak with your local coordinator.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Just before we carry on with the questions, I just want to mention as a reminder to all of our participants that this whole event is being recorded. So if you have to skip out for any of the questions, you'll get the recording with answers to all the questions that have been asked here sent to you by email. I'll move on here to Elizabeth's question, and Elizabeth is asking, what do the red and brown squares mean? And I think you sort of touched on it when you were showing the historic changes between the first and the second atlas, and the yellow dot versus black dots. But what are those differences in the brown versus red squares?
Yeah, there are 3 different shades of sort of reddy brown there. From the palest one would be birds that were only reported as high as possible breeding. And then the sort of middle orange one is birds that were recorded at the probable level, and then the darker squares were those that were actually confirmed breeding. I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear on the way through.
Yeah, that's great. And well, we can, Elizabeth and everyone is welcome to look at the recording again, was to get it back, to go back to your slide to see that. So,
yeah, or buy the book.
Or buy that second Atlas book. That was a great book. It's a
yeah, I should say that there are selected pages from the book currently available on the website. You have to dig around a bit to find them, but they are on there. You can get a better feel for a sort of cross section of species.
And that was birdsontario.org. Is that correct? The website?
That's right.
Yeah, excellent. Great. Eric has a question here. I'm not sure if you can flip through quickly enough, Mike, but Eric was wondering if you can show the list of the common birds again.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I might have to, I'll go out of my show and flip back that way.
Yeah. And it's quite surprising, that list, when you see how abundant those boreal birds are.
Yeah, where'd they go? I can't see them here. That's interesting.
It was later on.
Yeah, that's it there. Okay, so if I go back into show mode, it'll go, I can click through them.
Yes.
Yeah, so it really is remarkable. Like, really, it's not always, it's pretty obvious when you look at a map, but it doesn't always sink in with everybody that 80% of the province is north of Sudbury. And, so that's where 80% of the birds are. And most of them just pass through here for a few days in spring and a little longer on the way south in the fall. But it's a vast area with huge numbers of birds in it.
Yeah.
And these are mostly quite tiny little birds.
And then, of course, the next slide was the most abundant, which was the Nashville warbler, right? That 15 million, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah, that was a surprising one. I have a couple of questions here that are related from Sharon and Vicky. They're both asking that, should we or do you use iNaturalist or eBird for recording observations?
Yeah, we don't use iNaturalist per se, but we do use eBird. eBird is very similar in that it's checklist based and you get a track of your locations. And so we're actually about to write to all eBird participants. We haven't done it yet because our app is still in the developmental stage, and we didn't want to sort of get everybody, all the eBirders, struggling with our app. So our hope is that in the next month or two, it'll be up and fully functioning, and we can get a note out to everybody encouraging all those eBirders to get on board. But the Atlas system is designed so that if you are an eBirder, but you want to collect your data using the Atlas app or enter your data on the Atlas website, you can just tick a box that says send all my data to eBird. And so it happens almost instantly, but certainly the same day. When you submit a list to the Atlas, it is forwarded to eBird. And vice versa, if you collect an eBird list, now you'd have to put in all of the breeding evidences, of course, but you can then copy that, the checklist number from eBird, and you can transfer that to the Atlas project, to Nature Counts. It's a very simple thing to do, and because eBird doesn't always collect exactly the same information, you'll get prompted for certain bits of information. Say eBird may not expect or may not request details, but we might be interested in a rare species that eBird's not asking you to document. You might be asked at that time to provide some additional information for the Atlas. But it's certainly, we've tried our best to make the two it as easy as possible to move back and forth between those two projects.
Excellent.
And if I might just add one point too, on the Atlas website, there are some really fantastic videos if people are interested in learning about how to submit checklist data through the Nature Counts app. Those are really fantastic resources, so you can kind of go back and walk through the different steps for anyone who's kind of interested in watching those. So that's again on the birdsontario.org website under instructions and forms. You can find those videos.
Great.
Yeah,
And
thanks,
that's
Emma.
also where you can find your regional coordinator information. Can we assume that as well? So for all of your contact information, it's birdsontario.org then.
Yeah, and yeah, that's it. It's under the tools and resources tabs, there are just a wealth of resources. So if you're wanting to learn more about bird calls and different apps or websites that can help you with learning bird song, then there's resources like that. And then of course we have the manual and the many appendices. So just a wealth of information on that website.
Excellent. That's great. I have a question here from Sue. Sue's actually enjoying the presentation from the UK virtually. And she's just wondering if there's a standard approach across the world in the same years.
No, wouldn't that be wonderful? No, you may have participated in the atlases that have been done in Britain. The Ontario atlases actually grew out of the one in Britain. One of the sort of founding fathers of atlasing was over in Britain, saw the British book and brought it back and convinced us all that was something we ought to be doing here. So no, although there's a European atlas where all the countries have got together to do all their atlasing in a standard in the same years, that hasn't really happened in North America yet. In fact, in North America, things are much less organized than in Europe. I should say, though, in Canada, we're in pretty good shape. Birds Canada and Environment Canada work together to make sure that everywhere does an atlas project, at least everywhere where an atlas is feasible. And we've been coordinating them. They're quite expensive to put on, and so they tend to be staggered. Although a dream of mine has always been to get everybody working on them at the same time, because it really would be a wonderful thing. And I think now that it's so easy to collect data and use sites like eBird to collect this kind of information, and in the same way that the nature counts that we're using for the atlas is so readily available, that I think it does open up possibilities of trying to tie these things in on a more regular basis. And so eBird in itself almost acts as sort of a long-term monitoring project. The big difference, of course, is with something like eBird, people just tend to go to the same places where they're going to find lots of birds. With the atlas requires we get in and blanket the whole landscape. So it's good to have a narrow few years where we're very targeted on that, and it helps us increase our level of coverage and ensure we get more comprehensive coverage.
Great, thank you. An intriguing question from Dawn. Dawn is wondering, and I'm just going to add a little bit of interpretation here. If you're in one square and you're seeing different birds of the same species but at different stages of breeding, for example, one is nest building and then another is feeding young ones basically at the same time, and another one might be with fledglings, how does that get reported? Does it get reported only once or for each stage?
Well, it's reported for each checklist. You provide the highest information. You provide a total count. Say you're walking along, you see 6 different robins. So 6 goes in as the number for that checklist. And then what ultimately gets reported is the highest level of breeding evidence for that checklist. So if you have a robin singing, you could have it as a singing bird. And if you walk on a little further, you see one building a nest, that would go in as the code for that checklist. And then if you come across another one feeding young, that would be an even higher level of breeding evidence, and that would replace the others as the breeding evidence for that particular checklist.
All right, that's helpful. Patricia's asking, how is the compilation for the atlas funded?
Well, good question. a sort of combination of things, really. There's the bulk of the funding in these early stages of the project has come from Environment Canada. We've got a long-term relationship with Birds Canada and some of the other partners to run atlasing across the country. But the Ministry of Natural Resources contributes. We've got funding proposals into all kinds of different places. There's a big fund in the US that provides money to support research on neotropical migrant birds, so we've applied to them, and it's that kind of thing now. At this point, we're just going to any source that looks like it would be suitable for contributing to the project. And I should say, a lot of the organizations like Ontario Parks, Parks Canada, and others, they have quite a large number of staff who are helping out. So we get an awful lot of in-kind assistance as well as actual sort of financial contributions.
So it's a monumental undertaking, as you've sort of hinted at before.
It really is. Yes,
yeah.
It really is.
There's a couple of questions here that are regarding resources that you can use for birding by ear. I'm going to come back to those in a moment. I have one question here from Peter Simons, who's asking, I think it's the Peter Simons I may know personally. Peter's asking, he's asking, through your vast experience conducting these atlases, what would you say is the one thing or aspect of the project you get the most excited or thrilled by?
I think it's the end product. Actually seeing all that data pulled together into a form that is useful for all kinds of different purposes. It's what motivates me in all of this is the excitement of getting all these folks out there collecting information that's going to be useful for conservation purposes.
Right. Sharon was asking, what years of observation are covered by Atlas 2 and for Atlas 3? Now, I think Atlas 3 is this year and the next 2 years, right?
No, they're all 5-year projects.
Okay.
The first one was 81 to 85. The second one was 2001 to 2005. And this one's 2021 to 2025. Boy, I guess I hadn't realized I must have been shuffling my slides around and not left that in there. Boy, yeah, that's an important question. Yeah, the project takes 5 years to get all of this done. And so lots of time to sign up. If you're new to birding, there's lots of time to learn your birds and make a significant contribution to the project. Because we certainly had that in the past where people get turned on early, work hard to learn their birds and really make a big contribution.
And excellent. Thank you for that. I did have another question from Leanne about getting in touch with your regional coordinators. And just a reminder, if you want to get in touch with your regional coordinators, it's through the website birdsontario.org. You'll find the information there. And I had a comment from Kirsten Dahl at Ontario Nature, I think addressing the last question, or the question about the funding, that if you'd like to make a donation to Ontario Nature and designate it a gift towards the Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas, you can do that. And Ontario Nature membership gifts also contribute towards this 5-year project. So it's a very good point to make. Thank you, Kirsten, for mentioning that. Had a couple of comments about birding by ear. One of them was, is there an app or website that you can listen to a bird call and identify the bird, something like Shazam? I'm not sure, what would you recommend, Mike? I have something in mind, but well, please go ahead.
Well, Justin, why don't you give your idea and I'll complement that.
Well, I'm going to address it with the point made by someone else who's answered a question. Here's John Neville, who I believe is calling in from Vancouver, the Vancouver area. John is a recordist. He's been doing bird recordings for many years, and he has a bird songs of the Central Boreal Forest and bird songs of the Great Lakes. And you can purchase these actually as a CD if you go to nevillerecording.com, Neville recording.com, or you can find John Neville on iTunes, and you can train your ear that way with the recordings. But to address the point about the Shazam is an app you can get on your phone, and if you're at a restaurant and you hear a song that you like but you want to know who's singing it, you can have Shazam tell you who's the artist and what's the song. And this has been asked around a lot, just because I do a lot of birding by ear training. Is there something like that for bird calls? And in fact, there is one Unfortunately, not available for Apple products, so not for your iPhone, but for other platforms or for your desktop. BirdNet. If you look up BirdNet, I've actually seen it tested, and it can tell you, it'll suggest you what a bird or even like a random bird sound is. And I know this because I had a recording of a morning warbler chip call that I myself wasn't sure about. I recorded it, I started recording it, and then I walked up to the bird in the field, and then I saw that it was a morning warbler. Now I took that recording to my colleague at Algonquin Park, and he had BirdNet on his phone. So from my phone, which is an Apple phone that can't use BirdNet, an iPhone, I played the sound to his phone, and it suggested morning warbler. I'm like, how does it do that? So if you want the Shazam-like thing, like product for bird vocalizations, try BirdNet. Look that one up. I think you'll be amazed. Have you heard of that one, Mike?
You know, I'd heard about it. I haven't actually looked into it. Do you know, like, will it do songs? I mean, I can see that chip notes and such would be feasible. Do you know if it does songs as well?
I haven't tested. I haven't been able to test it, so I haven't even bothered. I thought, oh, it's not on iPhone, so I won't even bother.
Right.
But I suspect it does, and I think it's using the composites of spectrograms that are. It may be, in fact, at Cornell. I'm not sure if they're using everything in the Cornell and the Macaulay library of bird sounds, but it might just use the composites of all the bird vocalizations, the spectrograms, and take the data in and plunk out the results. So we could try it. You could have to try it.
Yeah, but yeah, as I mentioned it, I know we already in the Wildlife Service use it to find, not use that software, but other software to find things like nighthawk calls. You know, very distinctive, simple calls. They can usually be picked out in that way. But anyway, that's really cool. And you know. And the first atlas, we were saying we should be able to do that. And the second atlas, we were saying we should be able to do that. So we're obviously getting very close. So that is great news.
And I see Jamie here in the questions has also said BirdNet is an app which identifies bird song. So I guess Jamie may be using that too.
If I might just add a couple of suggestions in terms of learning resources too, like not necessarily for being able to, you know, an app that identifies the call for you, but you know, there's lots of free resources through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology website, through all the apps that are available. There are some sort of free and paid apps that have all the calls, like audio recordings that you could have on your phone and take when you're out in the field. And then there's a good, like Dendroica is a good learning resource, or Larkwire. So those are just some options that people could look into for apps or websites that can help with learning calls and songs.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Dendroica. Actually, a friend of mine designed and developed that, a very early edition of what eventually became Dendroica. And it is a really great resource for learning bird songs. And we've just made a recent update to it, which I'm not quite sure is on the current version, but will be in the next few weeks. And it allows you, it's got all the birds of North America in it, all the birds of Canada. You can just choose your Ontario list. You can choose a Southern Ontario list. But a new feature that we've added allows you to say, okay, I was in a deciduous forest and I heard a bird singing. Give me the list of birds that are in deciduous forest at this time of year in Southern Ontario. And you know, and then you can go from there. You can filter down to say, give me the birds that trill in forests in Southern Ontario at this time of year. And so really narrow down your search. So I think it's really quite a useful tool, and it's got lots of different versions of each song and vocalization so that you can get a better understanding of the sort of variety within each of the species.
Yes, and there's a couple here who have mentioned also Larkwire, which is an excellent online, actually it's not only online, but it's available online or as an app. Larkwire is a way to train your ear for bird songs in particular, and it's a good way to refresh in the spring before the migrants all return en masse. So that's a good one. And That's, yeah, Larkwire. Yeah, Anne Marie's mentioned Larkwire, and as well as Rhonda. So that's very helpful. I had a question here. How do you learn to become a better birder?
Well, that's one of the big frustrations about this atlas, is that COVID is upon us, and so we can't go encouraging people to do what we've done in past atlases, which is get together in groups and do this stuff. Go birding together and spend time with more experienced birders is the very best way to learn your songs. In the past and in the future, as soon as COVID is declined enough that we can do this again, we will be having group outings and that kind of thing to help people get together and learn more about it. And we actually going to develop a mentoring program for the atlas when we can do this kind of thing, to get more experienced people together with less experienced people.
Yeah. Excellent.
But otherwise, yeah, all those kind of resources that we talked about are all great in terms of helping you develop new skills. Well, I'd say one good thing, though, I would recommend is getting out early. This time of year is good because there's not that many birds back yet. So it's easier to track down what's singing and learn the song yourself directly from it. And then the idea being, if you can learn the common birds that are back now, then you can recognize a song that you don't recognize and can start to track that bird, and you get a better chance of finding it among the great mass of options when you know the common birds.
I had a technical question here from Ingrid, who was asking, what is the platform that you're using to record the data? ArcGIS?
No, well, everything that we enter goes into something called Nature Counts, which Birds Canada has developed. It's basically a big database system. I don't know enough about the mapping end of things, but our GIS folks will be able to tell you more about that. But I'm not sure they use ArcGIS for the specific mapping of the creation of the maps for the project. Unfortunately, I can't really tell you a good answer to that question.
Thank you. Guy is asking a question. He says you may have addressed this earlier. Presumably the results consider or account for changes to the number and distribution of volunteers over the 3 surveys? It's a great question.
Yeah, very much. That is a good question. Now, the point count is the ideal way, of course, because the point count is the standard amount of time. It's done at a standard time of year, and we know precisely where it's done, so we can repeat that exact point. The checklist, of course, we're going to get a lot more data this atlas, I expect, than we got in Atlas 2, and we got a lot more data in Atlas 2 than we got in Atlas 1. So the way we did the comparison between Atlas 2 and Atlas 1 was basically look at the number of birds that are reported in relation to the effort that went into it. And so it's going to be some version of that. And frankly, the analyses are getting so sophisticated these days, and they're changing so fast, it's hard to predict exactly 6 or 7 years from now, when we actually analyze all the data, what kind of methodology will be used. But as far as analyzing the checklist data, it's going to be there's going to be a way of using the effort that people have put in and relating that to the number of birds that they're reporting. We'll have the option this time, of course, of looking at that in relation to the habitats that they were in, and to the precise location, and to the distance that they traveled. So there's going to be lots of ways of doing the comparisons.
Great. Do you know anything about Song Sleuth?
No, not what I know of.
I suppose this is an app that helps you. I've heard of it, and I guess it might help you identify or learn your bird vocalizations. Another question here from Sharon. Do you work with Cornell and the Merlin app? Is there any relationship at all with the Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas?
No, not really. I encourage people to use Merlin. It's a great tool, but no, we have no, not a direct relationship. Our Nature Counts folks, the folks at Birds Canada, that are developing the database, they work quite closely with eBird, so that we've got smooth moving of the data back and forth between the projects. But overall, there's no sort of Atlas to eBird corporate relationship.
All right. Another question from Patricia. Patricia, you might have addressed this earlier because you talked about the second atlas that you still purchase it. Is it available through birdsontario.org? Is it?
Yes.
Through there? Okay.
If you go to, I should almost show the screen, but you can go right onto the onto the website, look at the archives information, for example, and you can find your way back there to the Atlas 2. Yeah. Or Emma would probably know, but I think you can probably still get at it directly from Ontario Nature website.
Yeah, you can purchase it through the Ontario Nature website as well.
Yes. And if I may just simply recommend the second atlas, I have it sitting under my television on the shelf, and I look at it and sometimes I think, I wonder what this, I just have these, random questions about birds, a specific bird. I wonder what, is it going down or up, or, what's the trend? And of course, that's the last resource we have, the last good resource. So I just pick it up and I look at the species and it confirms or refutes something that I think about a bird when I take the time to read the account. So it's good just to have when you have any question about the American robin or purple martin, whatever it is, you just go and look at it and it's like fantastic, dense, and supremely informative. So that's my plug for getting the second one. Even though it's past, still very, very helpful.
It is a very good resource, yeah.
Great book. And question here, from Leanne. This is an intriguing question. I'm not sure we can answer this one. Mike, in northwestern Ontario, in Kenora, they're seeing very few great blue herons, but lots of eagles. Is there a relationship there?
That is a good question. My brother used to live in an apartment in Victoria that looked out on a heronry, and he did say that eagle would frequently go in and take birds out of the nest, take the young herons right out of the nest. So I've never actually heard that described though as a cause for like what would be a major change in occurrence of the heron. I could see it being a local pest, but the eagle being a local pest to them, but I haven't heard that relationship. It's an interesting one. The heron is about the only large bird in the province that when we last looked at them that wasn't doing really well. All the others seem to be expanding very nicely, but the heron is the one, and the loon's kind of stable or declining slightly, but the heron showing quite a long-term decline. So I think there's a lot more going on with herons than we understand at this point, and it's possible that the eagle is somehow related in there, but I doubt it's sort of a major cause of the patterns that we're seeing.
Intriguing. And I just got a quick update from Anne-Marie, who's saying she has just found the BirdsNet app on the iPhone App Store, on the Apple App Store. That's like a newsflash. So now I'm going to have to go. Anyone with an iPhone, go to the App Store and look up BirdsNet. That's one word, BirdsNet, and see if you can download that and try it out with your local singing robin and see if it gives you robin as the answer. That's great. In what year, Tony's asking, what year will the Atlas 3 book be available?
Well, it's a good question. We haven't actually made a final decision of whether we're doing a book this time. It's sort of an assumption that we are, but we haven't actually made that decision. A number of the new atlases that have come out have actually just had a website. And of course, the nice thing about the website is you can do a lot more things, a lot more versions of maps and graphs and charts and links to all kinds of different things. So it's still not set in stone that we will be producing a book, but if we do, it's probably going to be on the same cycle, and so we'd be aiming for 2027 to get the book out. Great.
And I'm seeing here Sharon is asking, I guess it's in reference to the second atlas, but is the atlas also an electronic interactive version? Number 2 is not.
No, no, it's certainly not an electronic interactive version. We are intending sometime soon, I'm not quite sure when it's going to happen, to get the PDFs of the atlas onto a website, and so people can get access to it, but it's not going to be in an interactive form. Certainly Atlas 3 will be highly interactive, but I don't think the Atlas 2 version will be.
Great. And another comment from Sue about living near heronry. In the last 10 years, over 300 small egrets have arrived, and herons have declined. That's very interesting. Diana's just, I think Diana here may have also downloaded BirdNet, and I've just checked it out here quickly, and I see that it's there. So just to confirm, BirdNet is on App Store. You know what I'll be doing after this, trying it out. And I think that's all for our questions. So thank you all for your questions. And just a reminder, of course, this recording of this event will be made available to you, to all participants, and you're free to share to view the recording or to share it with anyone else who is interested. So I'm not sure, Emma, did you have any closing words?
I guess just a thank you to everyone for joining the webinar this afternoon, and to Mike for the wonderful presentation, and to Quest for hosting. And I guess one other thing that I might just highlight for participants is that in Mike's slides, he showed the Facebook and Instagram page for the Breeding Bird Atlas. So there's lots of events, like small little events, that will continue to be hosted online. We have a SAPI hour, which is sort of being an informal session addressing different aspects of the manual and kind of frequently asked questions that come up. So I would just encourage people to check out those resources as well. Of course, the Ontario Nature website also shares information about updates on the Atlas and upcoming events. So lots of resources, and really exciting time to sort of get involved in the birding community.
Yes, and if I may add just one thing, just to come back to the question of how to be a better birder, there will be many webinars coming up in the coming 4 weeks, covering all sorts of bird skills. If you check out Point Pelee National Park for the Festival of Birds, it'll be virtual this year. There will be a number of different introductory and maybe somewhat more advanced birding skill webinars. So you might like to look at those. Check out Point Pelee National Park Facebook page, and also the Toronto Bird Celebration page for other skills-based bird-related webinars. So thank you to all for attending. Thank you, Mike and Emma. And everyone, enjoy your afternoon.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.